The US is the country that made the world fall in love with automobiles. Not Germany, not England, not Italy. It was the USA. It all started in 1893. That's when the first automobile gasoline appeared in the country. And it was invented not by chemists, but by ordinary mechanics, two brothers making tools. But history has remembered them not as the inventors of gasoline, but as the creators of the first American car. And if they had known what kind of history their invention would launch. From this video, you will learn, how did the American auto industry come to be? How has it come to this day? What did the car companies do during the war? What mistakes did they make? What tricks helped them save millions? And why did the head of a car company smuggle cocaine? "160 years ago, back when Henry Ford was born, no one could ever have imagined the global changes in industry and culture that would take place over the next 10 to 20 years. Not to mention Henry's role in such changes. The United States has become the world's most automobile country, although in geographical terms, the automobile was first developed in Europe. However, it was nothing more than a means of transportation. Ford's contribution to the emergence of the new automobile culture is enormous, and here's why. This story began in 1863 when America was facing challenges and turbulent times. The Civil War was in full swing. Meanwhile, in the north of the country, a family of Michigan farmers had their first child. The boy was named Henry. 1876 was a life-changing year for Henry. He lost his mother at the age of 13, but also got a hint of what path he would take for the next years of his life. The hint, rumbling and fuming, past his father's wagon on the way to Detroit. It was a locomobile. Just to make it clearer, a locomobile is a tractor with a steam boiler instead of the common gasoline engine. Henry started to pick the machinist's brain about it. Proud of such an engineering marvel, he eagerly told the boy the way the steam engine worked. If not for that event, there might not have been any Ford Motor Company. In 1878, without saying a word, 16-year-old Henry left for Detroit. After working here and there and gaining experience, he was hired as an engineer at the Edison Illuminating Company, founded by the brilliant inventor Thomas Edison. Yes, the very Thomas Edison. In case you don't know anything about Edison, he was one of the major inventors of his time. Incandescent light bulbs, movie cameras, and the first music players. He was involved in the invention of all those things. We'll talk about him in our upcoming videos. Well, let's get back to Henry. He was 30 years old and it was 1893. A German Otto two-cylinder engine ended up in his hands, so he redesigned the engine and adapted it to a four-wheeled, self-propelled carriage. It was Henry Ford's first vehicle that could properly travel. Just think about it. It was 1893. There was no internet, no dedicated literature, not even a mentor. Nevertheless, Henry did it. It was a great success. The Edison Illuminating Company management didn't approve of the chief engineer's hobbies, and as a result, Henry resigned in 1899 when the choice of priorities had become a point-blank question. After all, Henry sold his first vehicle so he could get the money for constructing an improved model, a delivery van. Backed by the mayor of Detroit and assisted by several businessmen, Ford managed to accumulate enough money to create the Detroit Motor Company. In that project, Henry assigned himself the role of a common engineer with a salary of $150 a month. A year later, after selling only 22 cars, the company collapsed. The cars were expensive and inferior to their competitors. No sales? So Ford decided to stimulate them, dedicating himself to the construction of sports cars. He chose sports cars for one simple reason. Winning a race or even setting a record was the best advertising for any car company at that time. "Win on Sunday, sell on Monday," Henry said. Ford's first race car was ready in 1901, just in time for the start of the 10-mile circuit races. The race was won and the prize fund was used to establish his own company, Ford Motor Company. But that was only the beginning. In 1902, Henry built 2 more cars that made him famous all over America, Ford 999 and Ford Aero. The cars had identical structure. The first was fiery red, while the second one was bright yellow. Each had an 18.8-liter engine. 18.8 liters! The Dodge Challenger with its 6.2 looks like a little economy car. The only problem was to find a madman who would agree to drive this 100-horsepower monster on wheels without a body, brakes, and fairings. So, meet Tom Cooper, a cyclist, 1898 and 1899 cycling champion. When Henry showed him his beast, he was a bit shocked. He probably thought it should be called the Ford 666. Later, Tom asked Barney Oldfield to race him, upon which he heard, "Hold my beer." Then, in October 1902, he finished first in the 8-kilometer race. A nationwide reputation was gained. The charter capital for the new company derived mostly from the money won, and the road to realizing the dreams of the young Henry Ford was opened. June 16, 1903 is considered to be the date of the Ford Motor Company's founding. In theory, it is so. With the money raised from winning races and the help of a coal magnate, Henry managed to hire 12 workers, but the car assembly still took place in a brick garage of 76 by 15 meters on Mack Avenue. So far, it had been a sub-assembly of cars from third-party components. The next step to the crown of America's automobile king was the purchase of a controlling 51% stock. For those who do not quite understand what a stock is and why it's necessary to buy the 51% of the stock, let me explain. A stock is a share in a company. The percentage of stock you own is your share of the company. A stock is a share in a company. The bigger part of the company you own is your share of the company. The bigger part of the company you own, the more control you have over it. And if you have that 51% of the stock, that means you own most of the company, so whatever you say will happen. So let's proceed with our story. On November 22, 1905, Henry finally managed to buy the 51% of the stock. However, he was forced to sacrifice the revenues from selling the already successful Model N. Instead, he completely abandoned any third-party components. Ford was on his way to full independence. This process ended only in 1913. Even though orders for the Model N increased greatly, the work on the Model T started in an experimental room of Ford's factory on Paquette Avenue about 2 years before the car was announced to dealers on March 19, 1908. The car was a brainchild of a 12-member engineering team led by Ford. The Model T was first presented to dealers on October 1, 1908, with prices ranging from $825 to $1,000 depending on body type. The design of the Tin Lizzie, as it was affectionately called by customers, was extremely innovative and reliable. The frame was pressed from strong, lightweight vanadium alloyed steel. The frame featured a 4-cylinder engine based on the cast-cylinder block, which was another outstanding feature for that time, not to mention the specifications of the 2.9-liter engine. It produced 20 horses and could accelerate the car up to 45 miles per hour. In the past, shifting gears was a real mess. Ford developed a special gearbox for the Model T with simple and easy-to-understand pedal controls. There was no need for a clutch at all because the pedal had 3 positions: neutral, downshift, and upshift. There was also a brake pedal. Instead of a gas pedal, there was a lever behind the steering wheel. In modern cars, there's a lever to control the windshield wipers. That was enough to teach any kind of farmer how to drive a Ford in a couple of hours. Similar cars in the US market were worth at least $2,000, so only a banker's son could afford such expenses. It was simply impossible to buy such a car for $800 and later for $500. That's why the Tin Lizzie attracted queues of farmers, clerks, salesmen, and people who just cared about their freedom of movement. We are not surprised by the enormous sales of the Model T. Only in 1909, more than 12,000 cars were sold. The next year, 19,000, and by 1912, the total annual production of Ford cars was 70,000 items. Tin Lizzie was about 90% of the world's car fleet, and that was the car that put the world on wheels. The price of the base version had dropped from $290 by the time the last Model T rolled off the assembly line on May 27, 1927, and 15 million cars had been sold. Only the Volkswagen Beetle was able to surpass that record in a greatly expanded car market after World War II. Wait. How is this possible? How many people do you need to attract in order to assemble each year 500,000 cars in craftsman conditions, then sell them at a minimal price and make a good profit? That's what Henry Ford is all about. He developed the idea of the flow production process, implementing it in its most efficient manner by 1913. Simply put, he also invented the assembly line and managed to make the assembly process several times cheaper and faster. In the 260 M2 factory, there were light and perfectly ventilated halls in which belt conveyors were installed. The frame was installed at the beginning of the conveyor belt, and at the end of the belt, a finished car was pulled out. Each worker performed a specific operation. It was not a big deal. Once the part was delivered, the worker installed it, and the conveyor belt supplied the next vehicle. No extra fuss, no squatting, and no hustling around the workshop. Production and assembly steps were organized sequentially, so that parts were transported to the assembly point by the shortest route without any hassle. This reduced the chassis assembly time from 12.5 hours in October to 2 hours and 40 minutes by December 30th, 1913. Every part in the shop moves, boasted Ford in 1922. By purchasing parts in large quantities, Henry was able to reduce their price. Moreover, thanks to such highly optimized production, the cost of the finished product was not much different from the cost of the parts. A 15-minute lunch break, including time to go to the bathroom, was the only break in the boring routine of monotonous work. But the workers were paid $5 a day, working only 8 hours, which were the best conditions in the United States. Rigid cost control and time-saving production of the Model T sometimes reached absurdity. It's known that for a certain period, Tin Lizzie was only sold in black, simply because the black dye was the cheapest option, and lacquer with black pigment dried much faster. Henry Ford's statement that any customer can have a car painted any color he wants so long as it's black is related to this. This phrase indeed was relevant, but only between 1909 and 1914, when the Tin Lizzie's circulation was enormous. By 1927, Ford had become sole proprietor of the entire production cycle, starting with ore mining and ending with the production of electrical components. By this time, the Tin Lizzie had become obsolete and was replaced on the assembly lines of Ford's plants by the Model A. The Ford A failed to beat the record of the Tin Lizzie, but it also sold quite well, both in the States and in Europe. The price of the base model at the time was $390. The car was sold in more than 20 configurations, and more than 5 million copies were sold between 1927 and 1931. Also, the Ford A is famous for the fact that it was the first mass-produced, all-metal V8 engine block, thereby marking the era of the V8 among American automakers. The Model A was still at the forefront of the global automotive industry in many aspects, but Henry's days ticked away. His son Edsel became the company's manager. The model range expanded. The world's market faced global challenges due to wars. But we will remember Ford cars as the world's first affordable, reliable, and unpretentious vehicle that gave millions of simple people the freedom to travel. Buick's story begins in the 19th, yes, the 19th century. It was in Scotland. The country was peasant and poor. Everybody lived mostly in dugouts, ate potatoes, and could barely make ends meet. The Scots had not had enough of war. In 1945, the villagers noticed that their potatoes stopped growing. It turned out that a fungus had eaten them up, so the era of famine began. And what about our hero? His name was David Buick. He was born in the harbor industrial area, among the docks and the workmen's swear words. There was always work to serve the ships. David's father was a carpenter. Nothing is known of his mother. David was a clever and inventive young man, but in times of famine, there was little room for apprenticeship. You had to survive. One day, David's father slammed his fist on the table and said, "We're tired of living from scrap to scrap, tired of living among drunkards and beggars. We're going to the United States to make a better life for ourselves." Little David didn't mind. He was only 2 years old. The Buick sailed across the Atlantic and settled in Detroit. The U.S. wasn't much friendlier. Many Scots were beaten because of their religion. Riots were committed in Irish neighborhoods. All in all, crime, from which Irish gangs began to crawl. On top of that, there was hunger and poverty. Most immigrants lived in abandoned apartments, basements, and attics. Some lived in sewers. Apart from that, the newcomers didn't know the language, and some employers took advantage of that, first hiring the immigrants and then kicking them out. Without pay, of course. The migrants weren't satisfied with that. They drank, but there was nothing they could do. It was either kill or be killed. So much for the USA. History is silent on whether David had any of this darkness. We only know that his father died early, and the care of the family fell on the shoulders of Buick Jr. He delivered newspapers, drove goods around the city. In general, as much as he could, supported the family. At the time, studied at school. But now David is known not because he's David and not because he's Buick. Since childhood, the boy was inventive. Ideas came to him, but he couldn't make them come true. David's hormones were playing up. David was tired of being in the shadows. He was 15 years old, and he hadn't done anything great. With these thoughts in mind, the boy quickly left school and got a job at a plumbing company, which immediately recognized his talents. At first, David was hired as a mechanic. A year later, he was promoted to foreman. 12 years later, Mr. Buick was at the head of the company, majestically sporting a mustache. David simply took a friend and made his way to the top. There's a little secret to this story, though. How did David manage to win such positions? How did he go from ratty holds to spacious offices with leather chairs and lacquered telephones? As has been said, David was an inventor. He invented irrigation systems, enameled tubs, and even a toilet flush design. Be proud, folks. Now you know the name of the man who got your creations disposed from the toilet bowl. It would seem that there is nothing special about David's creations, but every one of his inventions is still in use today. Let's return to our muttons. At 32, David had a steady income. He had 13 patents in his pocket for his own inventions. 13, not a bad number, but it brought David to ruins. David may have had ADHD, a syndrome where you can't concentrate on something and constantly jump from one idea to another. So did our hero. He decided it was time for him to make cars. In 1903, he designed this old girl, a beauty. No kidding. Buick invented an engine for it, compact and powerful with holes where it was needed. Now the whole world drives such engines because their stuffing is simple and universal, like a Swiss watch.
That's a great plan, Walter. That's fucking ingenious if I understand it correctly. It's a Swiss fucking watch.
The business of the company, however, failed. Buick spent all the dough on the car, which, by the way, was given to a neighbor only for $300. No money, no workers either. On top of that, David had a huge loan putting pressure on him. Yes, it cost money to start your motor company too. That seemed to be it. The company was ruined, but Buick was not an easy one. He decided to give the wheel to a more experienced manager, the person who would lead the firm to prosperity. The candidate he was looking for quickly sailed into his hands. What David didn't know, though, was that he was going to be his own downfall. Bill Durant. That was the name of the enterprising American who raised the company from its knees. Bill, just like David, dropped out of school and went to work. But Durant Jr. had powerful parents who taught him how to make a buck from a dime. At first, Bill slaved in a sawmill. Then he got a job as a cigar salesman. At 24, Billy made his first company, where $2,000 startup grew to $2 million. Durant was enterprising, goal-oriented and prudent, but he was terrified of cars. It was a long time before Bill got the hang of the auto industry. He had previously kept his daughter away from cars, but his encounter with David changed him. He just put Bill in the car and said, "Drive." After excuses and bickering, Durant pressed the pedal. The same day he agreed to run the company and began repairing the Buick Motor Company. Durant, in fact, got nothing. There was no reputation, no fame. There was only one car that Bill took to the New York show. The decision played out. Durant came back with orders for 1,000 cars, worth considering that Buick had produced only 37 before that. The company was slowly growing. It took 4 years, and the Buick cars have become the best-selling. On top of that, Durant merged with other auto giants altogether. Thus, the General Motors Association was formed, about which we're going to... That's right, we aren't. There's already a video about it on the channel. Go ahead, click on it. We don't teach you business for nothing. David's business got worse day by day as he managed to fall out with Durant, who was firmly in power. We don't know exactly how Buick got kicked off the board. Perhaps he was hoping for his piece of the company, but Durant bought it out too. David, though, got $100,000, and he subsequently went bankrupt. Buick first invested money in oil. Then he decided to assemble carburetors. Neither of these or any other undertakings brought success. The aging David went completely broke and worked as an instructor at a crafts school. Sometimes he didn't even have enough money for food. In 1928, the 73-year-old Buick was interviewed. He said he had no regrets, and the next year he died of cancer, leaving the engines running without his creator. Durant, on the other hand, seemed to be thriving. He attracted big names to his concern: Cadillac, Oldsmobile, Oakland, Elmore. In addition, Bill bought auto repair shops, who would supply him with parts on the sly. It seemed to be a success. The business wouldn't go bust. If one company went under, others would rehabilitate it right away. But Durant had a lot of jealousies. They wanted him out of the office. And when Ford cars started selling better, Bill was made the scapegoat. That's life, folks. The company kicked out its breadwinner. "The hell with you," Durant said. He didn't ask for handouts from those who betrayed him. Instead, he stopped by Lewis Chevrolet for a cup of tea, and in between, started a new firm with him. Lewis was an experienced American racing driver. He first worked with Fiat, and then he got involved with Buick. That's where he met Durant. They hit it off, and when the director was replaced, the racer went with his employer. Bill and Lewis organized a company. They called it Chevrolet and attracted Durant's son-in-law to finance. The Chevrolet Classic 6 gangster cars rolled off the assembly line. An expensive luxury car, folding top, windshield. This beauty was selling well in the USA, being in demand abroad as well. Bill began to think about getting his company back. Soon, he had his chance. He and the Chevrolet had saved enough dough. He began to have creative differences with the car racer, and Lewis slammed the door, selling the company to Durant. Now Billy had money, just like Billy Bones in Treasure Island. The treasure, by the way, was not long in coming. And in 1915, William Durant bought out his former automobile company, not forgetting to let the traders fuck themselves. Cars again. Luck again. In addition, Billy also took over Chevrolet. That is, he beat everyone he could. What about the cars? Don't worry, there'll be transmissions, suspensions, and other stuff. The average viewer will also understand everything. After all, we have a business lesson. Let's start with the Buick F. This carriage was assembled 3 years after David left. But what would happen if you put a tarp over it? Voila! We've got a Buick 25, a gangster car that may have been driven by noodles from Once Upon a Time in America. Great movie, by the way. The Buicks were the first to think of putting a roof over cars. If they hadn't, who knows how long it would have taken for the driver to catch colds and swallow aspirin. And in 1934 came out this sweetie, where in addition to the Buick 66S, in it was a new engine. The car drove smoothly and comfortably with it. Ah, a dream. Trading my wife for a car. The continuation of the line was the Buick Roadmaster. There were models with a roof, without a roof, with long and short muzzle. In general, Bill Durant liked variety, and on this ground he had a split with Henry Ford. Enemies were everywhere, including behind Bill's back. Durant's colleagues didn't like his methods. You see, Bill designed all sorts of models so that everyone could find a car to their liking. Colleagues, on the other hand, felt that there was no need to spend too much. You could just pour a little money into your pocket, but that's my speculation. Fortunately for his enemies, Bill decided to leave. He was captivated by the Wall Street game of stock trading. It was almost a casino. The chart went up, the chart went down. Buy, sell, buy, sell. Blinded by the seemingly easy profits, Bill wasted his money and went broke. In 1936, he declared bankruptcy, and 6 years later, he had a stroke. His health was deteriorating. Bill grew weaker by the day. He died in 1947, apparently the fate of David Buick, who also died of lack of money and illness, was a hit. Bill, however, lived out his days on handouts from friends. Buick didn't have that, but he didn't complain about his fate either. But the power struggle was a sneaky one. Who poured their money into cars? Bill Durant, who's been selling 800 times more in 5 years. Bill Durant, who took the lead in the market, who upgraded the engines, who made $60 million for the concern. Bill goddamn Durant. The employees once decided to change the name of the company to Durant because it sounded better. Bill just brushed it off. He thought his last name was hard to hear, which is a serious problem for attracting new profits. So Buick evolved. A quick paint system appeared. In the old days, it took a month to do it. And in the 40s, it took 6 hours. Buicks were the first to put on turn signals. Many competitors reached this stage decades later, and BMW is still mastering this technology. By the way, Do you want a design trick? Many Buicks had airplane turbines in the back. It was after World War II, and fighter cars were liked by both servicemen and teenagers. Eventually, the turbines lasted on the cars for 45 years. Everyone dreamed of flying an airplane, and those who paid were successful. So what's coming out? Buick is a brand that has transcended reality. Even the creators of Need for Speed paid the money to put the GNX in their game. And the Riviera was driven by Jason Statham, Nicolas Cage, and was even featured in Back to the Future. Buick played FBI cars, and the film companies have to pay money for the copyright. Otherwise, they'll be sued. But there's no one to judge. So what is the reality? Buick was the market leader until the 2000s. Its tentacles reached even the totalitarian USSR. And in China, it was the most popular brand. Many Chinese guys gave up a bowl of rice to save money for a compact Regal. But in 2008, things took a turn for the worse. Companies went into a crisis. Even Ford and Chrysler were caught up in it. Money quickly ran out, and the Buicks asked for help from George Bush himself. Old George was expected to chip in a little money. The president helped, of course, but not with money. With a huge loan that made the whole company poor. 20,000 office workers were out on the street. As to the government, it quickly ate up General Motors, having presented a small piece to Canada. That's the moral of the fable. Guys, spend money on coffee, on sodas, on donuts at the local diner. Keep the money down, sell the house, but don't betray it. That's the forbidden rule of business. Durant fired Buick from the firm and went broke himself. Two identical fates, two identical ups and downs. Did you know that Al Capone had a Cadillac? Not just any Cadillac, but an armored one. Scarface often drove it through the streets, where a gun could stick out of every window. Cadillac, the guarantor of security. The details are accurate to the millimeter. Let's take a trip back to the beginning of the last century and find out why Cadillac was about to be disbanded and why Henry Ford would be the villain today. Cadillac's history begins in France of the 16th century. There lived a boy, Antoine de la Mothe Cadillac. He loved theology, studied zoology, caught butterflies. Cadillac's father had money, but he ran into influential people and they sued him, not forgetting to take away his fortune. Cadillac Sr. was pushed out of court, and his son went down a slippery slope. Drunkenness, debauchery. All in all, normal peasant youth. The authorities decided to take Antoine by the scruff of the neck. Boom! He's already in the army, where he makes friends with the officers and begins to engage in illegal schemes. We don't know what he was caught up in. All we know is that he was going to get married, but not to the woman he wanted more than his life, but to another unattractive lady. Antoine didn't like to get married without love, so he got on a ship with the help of the officers. Only after departure was he told that he was going to America to kill the natives and hunt for pelts. In the new land, Cadillac became a warlord. He roughed up the locals, turned into a trader, and built a house with a 17-year-old wife inside. The wife, however, sometimes didn't see Antoine for years. Cadillac sails away, sometimes in a canoe, and after around 4 winters, comes back with 80 tons of skins. Anyway, Antoine had a pretty good life. He founded Detroit, the future city of the auto industry, and ruined homes. Detroit, that's where the passions would rumble. Now flying into the 20th century, meet Henry Lalonde, an engineer who learned from his grandfather Colt and assembled guns for Lincoln's supporters during the Civil War. Freedom won, and Lalonde dove into fitting mechanisms, rose to an executive position, and his colleagues said of him, "A handy man. He'll fix the brains of hard-of-hearing people." Henry Lalonde is all about hard work, perseverance, and diligence. When he chiseled out a hair-cutting machine, everyone in the USA started wearing a brush cut. Then Henry dove into the auto industry. He was already a respectable mister with a tie and mustache. One day, some solid people came to see Lalonde. They said, "Henry, sir, we're losing money in this factory. We want to tear it down. Should we do it right away, or will it wait?" "It'll wait," said Lalonde, and invented his first car. Yes, folks, Uncle Ford worked for that company. Henry wanted to make race cars, but the factories didn't want to work. Not enough dough. When Lalonde came in, he immediately started telling Ford how to do business. The talented engineer decided to make ordinary cars. Ford decided it was of no interest to him and left, taking the name Henry Ford Company with him. Lalonde, on the other hand, pored over the drawings. In 1902, the Cadillac Model A came out. Yes, the company was named in honor of the French Sir who founded the city of car manufacturers. The car was reliable and comfortable, and most importantly, it could pull a cart uphill. Henry Lalonde turned his cars into a Lego constructor. Parts were as interchangeable as the magazines in an AK or bolts in an M16. One day, a British car club even took 3 Cadillacs apart, shuffled the parts, and reassembled the cars in front of onlookers. A little later, these models drove 500 miles. Anyway, the Cadillacs got a bonus and moved on. And then there were small trucks, covered cabs, and leak-proof interiors. That would have been fine, but they didn't make some of the parts right. That flaw killed the man who was Henry Lalonde's friend, Byron Carter. That was the name of the man who once started his stale car. Byron twisted the elastic knob, the car started, and he let it go. The knob bounced off his head, and from the impact, Byron died after a while. It took a long time for Lalonde to come to terms with the loss of his friend. When Henry stepped back, he said, "I won't let any more cars hurt people." The electric starter nestled in the Cadillac's stuffing. It allowed the car to start smoothly, and it gave people confidence. Electric headlights. The Cadillac was the first to have a high beam. Finally, you didn't have to carry shovels for bodies that had been run over. But that's just our fantasies. At the same time, Bill Durant was watching, the unassuming guy who would later take over Buick, Chevrolet, Oldsmobile, and the Cadillac. Mr. Durant said, "Join our automobile concern and I'll give you $5.6 million. Lalonde took the money and decided it was time to do his business. He had to become a giant tycoon who would flatten the globe by his belly. On this basis, Lalonde leaves Cadillac and starts the Lincoln Motor Company. And then Mr. Henry meets another Henry, Henry Ford. Ford noticed just in time that things were going badly for Lincoln. He quickly bought it and remembered to take revenge on Lalonde. At first, he thought he still had the steering wheel in his hands, but soon, saboteurs began to show up at the plants. They presented themselves as young men, trainees who would gain experience and get a job. In reality, these were Ford's people who were secretly taking over. When Lalonde saw the whole thing, it was too late. He lost control, and he and his son were demonstratively escorted out of the building. Detroit. It was here, in the old cottage, that Henry lived out his last days. Let's remember this old man. He was the archmage of engineering, a beloved leader, and he wasn't a bad person either. Goodbye, Grandpa Lalonde. You were 88 years old when you left the world, and your firm kept taking off and almost made it to heaven. Cadillac, on the other hand, was making armored cars, powerful engine, gear levers. The Army quickly took notice of the tasty ergonomics, and after the outbreak of World War I, 2,000 armored clunkers went to the front. After the war came the Roaring Twenties. Cadillac welcomed new faces. They were the first to hire a designer, Harley Earl, who first made chariots for Hollywood and drew LaSalle for the company. Gangster verticals, shatterproof glass. There was even a door that held golf clubs. It was Harley Earl who smelted the grille, the trademark of all Cadillacs, which you want to lick to a shine. By the way, in the 20s, Capone drove a Cadillac. He had an armored van from 28. The gangster was put in jail anyway, but the government confiscated his car. Rumor has it that Roosevelt himself privatized this beauty. When asked where he got the luxury armored car, Franklin said, "I hope Mr. Capone doesn't mind." Power boosters, steel roofs, silent transmissions. Why do we need it? It's boring and incomprehensible. Let's move on to World War II. Cadillac began stamping tanks for the front. You heard it right. Tanks. The M5 Stuart. This was the first machine rolled off the assembly line, and the war devoured a total of 1,470 pieces of such vehicles. During the war, a female designer also came to the concern. At first, Helen Rotter drew comics for the future Marvel, and then she went from jewelry to the auto industry. Helen was engaged in the upholstery of interiors. Check it out. The idol of retrofuturism, the Firebird 2. It wasn't a Fallout car, it was a real machine. The turbine blew 225 horses, and it had an autopilot. No, better than that. Autopilot prototype. Cadillac thought to place beacons in the roadblocks. Well, as on the runway, and between them, Firebird would race, gaining 185 miles per hour. However, the idea has remained on paper, and real cars are more interesting. By the way, we also have a video about this story on our channel. Many models of Cadillac were developed by female designers. That's why the Brougham included a makeup kit and magnetic glasses. The seats remembered the shape of the owner's bum, which made steering more comfortable. Power antenna, power windows, automatic door locks. These are not all the secrets of the little Brougham. Here, for example, tail fins. They even became the subject of quarrel. Harley Earl wanted to lower them, and his colleagues vice versa. In the end, when Earl left, designers just redrew the drawings and raised fins by 1.5 inches. The trick played out. The fins became the trademark of Cadillacs, although there were more serious innovations. The Cadillac Cyclone, for example, was equipped with radar. Special radars caught objects in front, and if you get too close to them, the cabin will beep with a special siren. Then came climate control and airbags. And then there were underground laboratories with 3D printers. Right, the 80s. It's about time. There's no limit to perfection. That was Cadillac's slogan. Cadillac won the Motor Trend Award 5 times, and in '84 it was listed in the Guinness Book of World Records. The longest car, 40 feet, 4 wheels. Cadillac even boasted that their assembly line was 9,000 miles, though taking into account the transfer of models to Italy. Do you know that Cadillacs didn't have runways? Yes. Loaded Boeings did not fit in the airport, so they had to pour concrete in order to make the Atlant E model see the world. What's more, the Cadillacs even had NVDs. Night vision gave you the ability not to hit a deer in the dark, and therefore was useful to mere mortals, and probably the FBI as well. Okay, next we have... What? Excuse me? Oh, we just got word that an FBI agent has contacted us. He's ready to be interviewed and talk about the president's Cadillacs. Sir, hello. Good evening. Yes, good evening. My name is Classified. Served in the FBI from '84 to 2000. Roger that, Mr. X. Can you tell us about the president's Cadillacs? Well, there's nothing criminal here. It started with Hoover and Eisenhower. The former took a Cadillac to the Victory Parade, the latter to his inauguration. Then I got into the FBI. It took 4 years to assemble one car because you have to sew armor plates, armored glass, and fully seal the interior. So it was quiet inside, so no one could get in. The door is 8 inches thick. Obama's Cadillac, for example, weighs 8 tons. The armor is heavy, but it can withstand a shot from an anti-tank grenade launcher. The door there weighs as much as a Boeing's one. You can't break through it with any caliber. And they put oxygen in the cabin so they can breathe. It's important to the president. Thank you, sir. And if the president's car is written off, where will it go? It will be destroyed immediately. The Secret Service is in charge of that. They park the car, fire on it, throw grenades at it. In general, they check to see how good the president felt there. I don't say anything else about it. What about Bill Clinton's Fleetwood? As far as we know, it's standing in the presidential library right in front of the visitors. Yes, unfortunately that's correct. I was strongly against the idea, but Clinton was adamant. Like, the windows are tinted, like no one is allowed in the cabin. But the fact that the Cadillac is out in the open, they could easily steal the technology. Thank you, Mr. X. Wow, we had a retired FBI agent with us. And now we're moving on into other days. Did you know the Pope had a Cadillac with armored glass? There was a special glass container with a papal seat in it. It was the Pope-mobile that saved the pontiff from an assassination attempt. He was attacked by a 16-year-old. But what about the Cadillac now? Is it worth buying? In 2018, Cadillac stopped being the most popular national premium brand in the U.S. market for the first time in post-war history. It was overtaken by Elon Musk sitting behind the wheel of a Tesla. Despite its successes, the company is directly affiliated with General Motors, and GM itself has become a clumsy giant. Starting with the Chevy Corvair story, it's as if the company is deliberately burying itself and dragging Cadillac behind it. Open your eyes. In front of you, there are strange arrows and levers. Where do you think you are? That's right, folks. This is the interior interface of the Chevrolet Turbo Titan, a 60s tractor trailer that is forgotten and unknown these days. In the 60s, America was obsessed with space. Car companies built rocket and moon rovers to keep up with the industry's needs. Chevrolet, the hero of our video, also kept up with the times. It assembled a truck with FM radio, cellular system, and even 2 steering wheels, one working, the other was a spare. Headlights and turn signals came out of special housings, and the gas turbine engine pulled over 77,000 pounds with 280 horsepower. Doors opened upward, like Ferrari, but the truck never reached the assembly line. The crisis hit. There was less and less gasoline in the USA. Under such conditions, people needed cheap cars, and the space design was never forgotten. Chevrolet has always listened to their customers. If you want pickups, you have pickups. You want armored cars, like the M6 Staghound? You get them. Chevrolet created VIP cars for the president. Their cars were used by security companies. Let's find out everything about Chevy, where its logo came from, and why the development of the Camaro was kept a secret. (1878), Switzerland. A watchmaker, Chevrolet, witnesses the appearance of his 7th son, Louis. The baby doesn't understand that his last name means goat's milk. He eats porridge, gets bloated day by day, and starts skipping school because he has to help his father in the workshop. The Chevrolet family wasn't wealthy, but Louis had a gold hand. First, he repaired clocks, After he moved to France, he fixed bicycles, and then he evolved into cars, which at the time were called self-propelled carriages. The boy found talented teachers who calibrated the movements of his hands. Pop, and Louis is already a 6'5" big guy who competes in bicycle races. The first falls, the first victories. Firstly, his first place was mentioned in a local newspaper, and then he became a finalist in 28 competitions. Daddy Chevrolet apparently realized that there is no such a thing as a lot of good children. He made up his mind and cut up little brothers for Louis. They jumped on their bikes and began to pedal the velodromes. Now there was enough income for the family. The bonuses from the races provided for the Chevrolets, and that was just a precursor to the heyday of this glorious family name. One day, Louis was repairing a tricycle. He bolted everything back into place in 3 seconds and went about his business. "Wait, young man!" There was a shout from behind him. Louis turned around and couldn't believe his eyes. In the tricycle seat was Vanderbilt himself, the famous financier, billionaire, and sponsor of auto racing. Slowly smoking a cigar, Vanderbilt said, "Your work is extremely skillful, Chevrolet. Cross the ocean. The sea is warmer there and the speed is higher." The billionaire turned around and drove down the street, and in Louis's mind the thought matured. We must conquer America. 1899. Louis Chevrolet arrives in Paris, where he changes workshops like socks. There he studies the structure of cars, touches the engines, and earns a coveted ticket. Sailing to the US, Louis runs into trouble. The firm he got into goes bust, and he has to moonlight as a mechanic and a chauffeur. While doing part-time work, Chevrolet met his wife-to-be. At least that was worth moving to the USA for. Then Louis got a job at Fiat. He also found a job at a friend's car company. One day, Louis's co-workers got together in a bunch, looked him over firmly, and said to him, "Man, why don't you be a car racer?" At first, Louis was shoved onto every track in a row. He was injured, hospitalized, and that was the price of daredevilism and reckless driving. At one practice session, Louis even flipped over. He didn't get his head cut off just because he hid in the car. But for Chevrolet, the track was like a knife through butter. The public loved his escapades, and the newspapers lauded him as a madman or a daredevil. The organizer of the race was Vanderbilt, the man who predicted Louis's bright future. The Chevrolet name was all over the newspapers. The flash of the camera stirred the Swiss blood. When his fame blossomed, he was invited by Buick to meet the director named Durant, and after a coveted handshake, he became the head of the racing team. Bill Durant, the man was not as simple as he seemed. To find out how he made the world's greatest car company and why he got kicked out, click on the hint above and subscribe, or I'm gonna cry. So the director Durant had been ousted. Buick, Cadillac, Oldsmobile, Oakland, all of these brands had appeared with his help. However, he had an ace up his sleeve. Before he left the office, William grabbed a blueprint of a new car. He came to Louis with the paper and asked, "Will you build it?" "I will," Chevrolet replied, and set to work. Durant understood that the name of a famous racer would intrigue fans, so the company was named after Chevrolet. Louis, however, did not run the company. Durant gave him the job of chief engineer, and that turned out to be a stepping stone into a trap. Okay, I'm revealing a lot. So far, the company needed a logo. No one knows how Chevrolet got its logo. Durant said he drew it from wallpaper. His daughter said Daddy accidentally sketched a cross at lunch. And his wife hinted that Bill stole the logo from the coal miners. Talk to women after that. Well, Official procedures aside, in 1911, the Classic 6, the first Chevrolet car with electric headlights, a starter, and a powerful engine, came out. The sleek lacquered doors, elegantly pitched roof. Everything was expensive and rich and suitable for the true nobility. Louis was truly proud of his creation. Durant was far from happy. The price tag of $2,150 was beyond the means of ordinary workers, and they bought a simple Ford T. It cost 3 times cheaper. Ford's cars were becoming more and more popular. Its cars were spreading to Mongolia, and Chevrolet couldn't win back a piece of America. The Ford T was convenient, cheap, and durable. Everyone bought it, while the competitors' cars were nervously trembling on the roadsides. Durant realized it was necessary to stamp cheap goods. Louis Chevrolet became an obstacle. He fought and resisted in every way to have his name crowned with anything but the luxury class. The arguments with Durant intensified. Louis shouted angrily, "I sold you my cars, I sold you my name, but I'll never sell you my soul." Bill once sarcastically hinted, "You smoke cheap cigars, Louis. It's time you lived up to your standards." Not bad. My wife can't even get me like that. Louis figured it out. He quit the company in a frenzy and then sold his entire stake. Who knew his piece of Chevrolet would be worth millions of dollars? Louis founded firm after firm, but they all went bust. Chevrolet became impoverished and started fixing clocks, just like he did when he was a kid. Then he managed to get a job as a car mechanic. The job was given to him by the same General Motors that absorbed his promoted firm. Chevrolet works for a pittance. Then came aging. Louis began to run out of steam. Doctors discovered he had atherosclerosis of the lower extremities, a disease of racing drivers that causes his legs to lose weight, hurt, and ulcerate, a clear sign of gangrene, unfortunately. Louis had his legs amputated. He was unable to recover and died after the operation. Louis was only 63 years old. He left our world on June 6, 1941. It's a tradition of our channel to remember good men. Although Louis was hot, he was a hardy softy and had golden hands. Chevrolet has a monument in Indiana. May this video also resurrect the memory of Louis, without whom the iconic company wouldn't exist. What about the company? Durant flooded the market with cheap cars like the Chevrolet 490, with luxury gadgets like starters and electric headlights. People were buying up cars so fast that the mountain of bills Bill was sitting on gradually grew to Kilimanjaro. There was really a lot of money, so much so, in fact, that Durant bought back the General Motors and started running Cadillacs and Buicks. Then came this, and this, and this. These cars finally ousted Ford T from American streets, and the company's tentacles were climbing to more and more American cities. Then the SUVs. This baby looked like an ambulance, but had removable seats and an impact-resistant body. Thanks to this bus, Chevy drilled the market of SUVs for many years. The 40th year was a great year for Chevrolet. The company made 1.6 million cars. Bigger is better was the company's motto in the 40s. But new technology was also coming to the company, which was moving the brand forward. Wooden parts were replaced by steel ones. New lamps were screwed in, bright and durable. And all would be well. Build, sell, sell, build. But World War II was coming to America. Either get ready or lock up the cabinets. We don't know how the company got through to White House. There was probably an inside man in the government. In any case, Chevy snuck up on the government office and got orders for casings, anti-aircraft guns, and bomber engines. The head of the company even got into the Department of Defense. In general, it is clear connections are the most valuable resource. The generals smoked all night long and decided, "We're done with ordinary cars, guys. Now you, Chevy, will assemble armored cars, and there's nothing else for you except Army orders." The directors of Chevrolet got a little discouraged. They sat down, had a smoke, and thought of something too. Now the rules were loosening in the factories. Each foreman set tasks as he wanted, not as the regulations required. There was a transport network between the factories, and resources were evenly distributed throughout the factories. It was under these conditions that this appeared. The generals asked to make a light armored vehicle, and in fact got a tank. It shot smoke grenades and was equipped with 3 machine guns and a cannon in the middle. This was no longer a car, but the Optimus Prime. It weighed 31,000 pounds. The armored truck was good. Cannons shoot and the wheels melt the dirt. But the truck was the heaviest of all its fellows, and the money for its assembly was large. It would seem, did not Chevrolet fulfill the order? Would the White House swallow up all the plants and factories? Fortunately, there was a place for the armored cars. They were shipped to the Allies in Great Britain, Canada, India, and Australia. Even the New Zealanders got these babies. That was Chevy's motto while the war was raging. The company really did succeed. Getting into the government and army, that was the price of survival in World War II. So Chevy went back to civilian cars. We reel in the uninteresting. Reel in the uninteresting. Here it is. Beautiful thing. I'm drooling over it. And we made a whole video about this car, the Chevrolet Corvair. General Motors was sued because of it. New buyers were afraid to get into it. Keep reeling. Keep reeling. My tongue is getting leaden. Oh, Bumblebee. Excuse me, Camaro. Did you know that this beauty was being developed in secret? There was no word of the Chevy Black Panther. That's what they called the Camaro before it went into production. Panthers eat Mustangs, and Mustangs are Ford cars, and Chevy muscle cars had to eat their prey. Good irony. Learn from it, guys. Everybody thought the company was in its heyday. Both workers and officials drove the Chevy. However, the second hit came to the company. If the first one was direct, then the second one almost became an uppercut. October 6, 1973. Syria, Egypt, Iraq, and Jordan group together and point tanks at Israel. 250 helicopters, 1,500 planes, and 4,500 pieces of heavy equipment fly into Israel. The war seemed to be a foregone conclusion. Israel woke up. Israel stretched out. Israel turned around and struck the invaders so hard that the Egyptians were surrounded and the Syrians were completely outgunned. So Israel was approaching Cairo and Damascus. Both cities were capitals of the mentioned states. Just in time, Richard Nixon jumped in. Ha, and we're giving Israel weapons. Now our soldiers will get in there too. Ha. The Arab presidents were already thinking of shooting themselves, but the idea occurred to them, let's take the world's oil. That's how the US ran out of gasoline. There were kilometer-long lines at gas stations. Even-numbered drivers could fill up only on even-numbered days. Odd-numbered drivers could fill up only on odd-numbered days, and so on and so forth. Naturally, nobody bought cars. The cars burned a lot of gas, and gas was extremely expensive. It would seem there were no buyers. Nobody needed the cars. What could one do? The way out was found. The small capacity cars. This is what the people with every liter counted for. Chevrolet Vega, burning engine, farting exhaust. A body that was rusting faster than my joints. A dream car, that's for sure. However, it sold well. The Vega didn't use much fuel, which was the main thing. It was possible to learn from Chevrolet to overcome crises, though not of the middle-aged kind, but all over the world ones. Look at this picture. You are looking at a typical American car, at least at first sight. In fact, this is a notoriously unsafe Chevrolet Corvair, a Chevrolet made for 10 years, from 1959 to 1969. The car was known for being extremely unsafe. The fact that it could flip over at any bad turn and was prone to excessive skidding. This was due to the design of the car. This is what remains on the surface. In fact, everything is much deeper and more interesting. In this video, we will try to explain where exactly in the design there was a miscalculation, what was happening during turning, and what journalism has to do with it. Chevrolet Corvair. Why did it roll over? General Motors was already one of the major manufacturers of American cars at the time of the early 50s. Their Chevrolet Corvette was one of the best American models. However, it was beginning to lag behind its European counterparts both in design and in power in its price segment. The rear-mounted engine was rapidly gaining popularity, and Germany's Volkswagen introduced the legendary Volkswagen Beetle, famous for its easy handling, low price, and reliability. The Chevrolet Corvair was conceived as the American answer to the appearance and growing popularity of these rear-engined models, and it was intended to respond to both compact cars and European sports cars, which in those years were the Volkswagen Beetle or Porsche models. The design of the car was invented in the late 50s, and in 1959, the car was already on sale. This answers the question of why the rear engine layout was chosen. It was a revolutionary car for America. It had to be a competitive solution. The Corvair had to be a car that combined features of both common passenger cars and sports models, so its design was similar to the lightweight Volkswagen Corvair. But it weighed an impressive amount and had an equally impressive engine volume. It was also due to the fact that Americans were not interested in compact, low-power cars. They needed a big interior for the whole family, and the Corvair provided it. The main thing is that it cost less than $2,000, which in the first year ensured sales of over 200,000 copies. As a result, thanks to these features, it could accelerate to high speeds, which, of course, overshadowed its European counterparts. But unlike them, it was very dangerous when cornering at high speeds. All generations of Chevrolet Corvair were the versions of the single base, with an air-cooled, rear-mounted six-cylinder engine. Simply, it was an engine with the cylinders arranged horizontally. This was very unusual and new at the time. It had a transaxle transmission. It is the type of transmission where the gearbox and the main gear are in one case. The model also had independent suspension of all wheels. The rear axle, or beam, to which the rear wheels were attached, took more than 60% of the weight. The engine was very flat and low located, which allowed creating cargo passenger versions, vans, even pickups on its base. Engine displacement varied from generation to generation, but never went under 2 liters, and most often stayed at 2.5. The engines were very powerful, producing up to 80 horsepower. There was also a turbo version, which could give 180 horsepower. But it is not necessary to know more about characteristics. First of all, the main peculiarity interesting to us is the danger of this car. The young man you see in the video may be said to have personally organized the funeral of the Chevrolet Corvair. Of course, jokes about its excessive lack of control have been around for a long time, but the journalist took it extremely seriously. His name is Ralph Nader, and he wrote an investigative journalism book that changed the world. It came out in 1965 and was called Unsafe at Any Speed. It was one of the first studies to deal with car safety. It described the dangerous design practices of certain American cars, among which was the Chevrolet Corvair. Now, it was put in front and center under Ralph's attack. The book had a great resonance in the US of those years and publicized the very problem of safety on the roads. It consists of 8 chapters. The first chapter was entirely devoted to the car we are considering. Ralph Nader compared the car with its European counterparts and came to very depressing conclusions. It was he who said that the model was uncontrollable, prone to accidents and overturns. He blamed everything on the car manufacturers, pointing out that it was almost deliberate negligence to safety, to the car, and to the consumer. Interestingly, his conclusions were speculative. He was not a scientist or engineer, only a journalist, and he had never, up to a certain point, gotten behind the wheel of a car. However, if you want the full story of the book and how it affected and changed the world, write us about it in the comments. There were 2 aspects to it. First, it was the human factor. American drivers didn't know the peculiarities of driving rear-engine cars, where, as we said earlier, 60% of the weight was on the rear axle of the car. Because of this, cars built this way were always prone to oversteer and as a result were hard to drive. It required very quick and clear reactions from the driver. Also important was the fact that the rear wheels were always supposed to be inflated more than the front, and it was often overlooked. The low price was a factor too. The car was available to almost everyone. Students, housewives, and inexperienced drivers could afford it. What was happening was that these people were buying a car which was cheap, which required a lot of experience, and a driver who could handle it. Many accidents happened because of this. Secondly, the design of the model was also to blame. The rear suspension was imperfect, cheapened as much as possible, and the Corvair had wobbly half axles at the rear. As you can understand, that very beam was not joined together. Its halves were simply attached to one joint, at the bearing, and moved separately, and there was simply no stabilization of any kind, something that would bring the wheels to the same level. It's not a new concept. It's been used in many cars, but you have to understand that it hadn't been applied like that anywhere else. The manufacturer wanted to achieve comfort at high speed. The car weighed too much, so it was forbidden to accelerate to high speeds with this design. It was also forbidden to go into corners at high speed because the inner tire would loosen up and the lever would give it lift. The outer wheel, on the other hand, would start to bend and break at the joint. If at that moment you braked hard, there would be a force that would lift the car with almost 100% chance. And very importantly, the car had no anti-roll bar on the rear axle. It only cost $15. However, the company wanted to create a cheap car, so they decided to save money on that. Of course, it was possible to add it, but it was an optional package, and not many people knew about it, to their great regret. It wasn't even mentioned in the advertising brochure. It wasn't mentioned anywhere. Many European cars of the time had the same suspension, but they were low weight, had no ability to reach high speed, which made them much easier to drive and much safer. All these reasons combined to create such a great danger of overturning, which repeatedly led to victims. There were many lawsuits filed against the company before the book was even released, and the Chevrolet Corvair was involved in so many accidents on the road. None of this escaped the attention of the curious and sharp-tongued Ralph Nader, and it was all covered in his resonant investigation. The book, as expected, had a great resonance. The authorities even reacted to it, but that's in another video. Now, we are much more interested in the reaction of the company that produced the Corvair, Chevrolet. They were furious. That is the only way to characterize their behavior and strategy. There was no room for a cold and reasoned response. Instead of destroying their opponent with direct evidence because he made many blunders from the technical point of view, which is understandable because the man did not know much about cars, GM went the other way. They tried to discredit him and ruin his reputation. They hired a private investigator and began following him and listening to his phone calls, trying to ferret out information about him that would destroy his career, thus marking the book as a complete lie. General Motors sought denunciatory facts about his biography, and the media poured in devastating articles, which, of course, had no effect. General Motors even hired girls who pretended to be prostitutes and flirted with Nader. However, Nader proved smarter than his rivals. He quickly found out that he was being followed and sued General Motors for invasion of privacy, and through a lawsuit won $500,000, and the company publicly apologized to him. The main thing that doesn't fit with this whole case is that whatever life Nader led, it didn't change the fact that the book was true. At least General Motors itself did nothing to disprove it. That was even more damaging to their reputation and to the reputation of the automobile. The book, Unsafe at Any Speed, created a horrendous negative background for a car that already had far from the cleanest of reputations. Lawsuits from car owners poured in unbelievable numbers. They blamed Chevrolet for withholding important information and for low quality of the product. The last straw was a recent accident in which a popular American comedian named Ernie Kovacs crashed. He was driving a Corvair. General Motors had no time to fend off attacks and accusations in its direction. As a result, it was forced to pay compensation to all the victims and urgently fix all the defects of the car. The same year, the rear suspension was completely redesigned. The arm kinematics were corrected. The Corvair began to be fitted with a more expensive and advanced circuit from the Chevrolet Corvette sports car. But people did not want to forget the grand scandal that was connected with Nader. The car sales were rapidly declining. Previously, 250,000 cars had been sold per year, but now just over 27,000 were sold. The car's popularity dropped tenfold. The car reputation was irrevocably ruined. It wasn't selling anymore. In such a case, General Motors was able to make only one solution, the only right one. After 10 years of production and record sales, the Chevrolet Corvair was phased out. But this was not the end of the story. 2 years later, after the Corvair was no longer in production, the National Transportation Safety Board tested several cars, including the Corvair. More precisely, 2 of them. The first was the one of the dangerous suspension, which came out until 1967. The other was a modernized and improved version, which came out after the Great Scandal. The conclusions were unexpected. The old Chevrolet Corvair withstood comparisons with its peers. Its stability and handling did not cause an abnormally high tendency to lose control and roll over, and was at least not worse than the other cars used in the tests. This conclusion completely contradicts Nader's claims and essentially trashes his investigation, at least regarding this car. However, a former top manager of General Motors by the name of John Delorean said that the criticism of the handling of the model was fully justified. And if you ask the engineers about this type of suspension, they will answer that the kinematics of this scheme in combination with a weighted rear end does not work best. And since then, This scheme has never been used in automobile construction. After this big scandal, very strict safety standards were introduced in the USA. Items such as a contoured braking system, seat belts, soft interior trim, telescopic steering pad, and head restraints became mandatory in cars. Safety in American cars was now taken to a new level, several times higher than before, all thanks to one car model alone, a model that revolutionized first technically and then in terms of safety. It was after the Corvair that people began to pay more attention not to speed and car design, but to personal safety and reliability, to the certainty that in the first accident they will not die. There are still debates about the Chevrolet Corvair. Most people remember this car as one of the most dangerous models in history. Some people paid attention to the tests that were done after the car was discontinued. Some people think that the scandal broke out fairly. Others think that the car fell the victim of conspiracy and someone's personal gain. It seems to us that the truth will be somewhere in the middle, as it usually happens in such situations. Nader's approach was characterized by radicalism, which in this case too was very far from the truth. But the Chevrolet Corvair certainly played its part. It became the car that divided the whole industry into before and after phases. It only took a little touch to make a car that you see in the video explode, killing both its driver and the driver of the other car. At least that's what everyone said about this model. The situation is controversial, but we think it's pointless to argue that it was an absolute failure for Ford, and also one of the worst cars in history. In front of you, you see the legendary, in its cheapness and low quality, Ford Pinto. Why did it become like this? Why did the engineers turn a blind eye to an obvious fatal mistake that could have easily been prevented? Let's look into it. The history of American cars has been side by side with the European car industry since the early 50s of the last century. Eternal opponents, irreconcilable enemies. They tried to outdo each other by all parameters. Thus, at the end of the 50s, German manufacturers introduced the Beetle, a format of small cars with a low-capacity engine. Compared to the expensive cars of the previous years, the Beetle cost very little. Many Europeans could afford to buy such a model without thinking twice. This shipment came to the US as well, headed by the famous Volkswagen Corvair model. In the American version, it was called the Beetle. Naturally, the American car industry had nothing to oppose such a format, and it was gaining in popularity every year. At that time, several cars came out at once, aimed to answer the Beetle. General Motors has released its latest models. We told about their failed Chevrolet Corvair on another video. The business has not stopped only with that. The magnificent Chevrolet Corvette was released. Chrysler Corporation also prepared and released Plymouth Valiant, recognized as one of the best cars in history. The great and powerful Ford Motor Company also did not stand aside. Ford Falcon model followed, which also became a kind of answer to Volkswagen. All of these were the same small cars, and quite cheap, usually priced under $2,000. But these cars were still made for the American mentality, with a love of luxury, high speed, and large size. That's why they didn't end up being the answer to the Beetle models. The manufacturers quickly realized this, but they did nothing until the mid-60s. Structural change was beginning to spread through the country. The American mentality had changed again. Gone was the love of luxury. Comfort and security became a much more important priority for U.S. residents. The strongest demonstration of this was the import of the second wave of small, compact, and comfortable cars. It was the Japanese auto industry, Toyota and Datsun. This predetermined the emergence of a new model format in the US. Instead of the usual compacts, which hold up to 6 people and have a solid size, there were subcompact cars of relatively small size, usually holding up to a maximum of 4 people. By the way, the car in question today could seat 2 people in the original configuration. Then there was a version of the Classic, which had enough space to comfortably fit 4 passengers. These models did not become part of the popular segment of cars for the whole family at the time, and took a niche position in the role of not the only, rather a spare car. They were bought by inexperienced drivers, women, and students. Not least of all, this is due to the low price of this kind of car. As luck would have it, Ford already had experience producing small models. It quickly accepted the new rules and began to work on a new model. This model was called the Ford Pinto, and it was introduced in 1970, the day after General Motors introduced its subcompact, the Chevrolet Vega. However, we mentioned that Ford Motor Company had a history of producing small cars. There's a reason for that. They designed their car based on the experience of the Ford Cortina, a car that failed to carve a niche in America, and based on the Ford Escort, from which they took the transmission and propulsion transmission for the Pinto. It was not made for nothing. The manufacturer wanted to introduce the car by the fall of 1970, when the development was only at a full speed in 1968. It was given a period of 25 months to create a complete and new model. Usually new cars were created within 3.5 years, or 43 months. So this turnaround in the creation of the car is considered the fastest in history. The manufacturer wanted to see a model that would weigh less than 4,000 pounds and cost less than $2,000. In the end, Ford Motor Company presented the market with what seemed at first glance to be an incredibly high potential model at a very low price. And that potential could have been unleashed if not for the striking, perhaps overly conspicuous, negligence of the engineers. The price of the car was incredibly low, $1,850. It was the sum of 5 salaries of a typical American. Even a student, if he wanted to, could afford a Ford car. It would seem to be a goal of unthinkable success, even for Ford. But this low price was conditioned by those peculiarities, because of which a scandal broke out around the Pinto, and production of the car was stopped. We are speaking about maximum possible cheapening of all components of the automobile. Everything was economized: the engine, the steering wheel, the suspension, the materials the car was made of, safety, even comfort, that is, everything that was so demanded in America at the time. The reason for this was an incredible rush and a desire to create a car that almost all citizens could afford. Usually the process of outfitting a car, that is, the process by which the parts necessary for the car are created according to the design of the engineers, takes 18 months. That is, everything goes in sequence. First, the parts are created, then engineers test them. And when they find out that the parts pass the quality test, they are sent complete sets to the car makers, who will build a new car out of the designated parts. In the case of the Ford Pinto, everything looked quite different. This perhaps can be called the most unusual case of building a car. The fact is that the tooling went on simultaneously with the creation of the car. It means the engineers were figuring out what parts were needed and how to produce them at the same time. To give you an idea of how engineers felt at the time, imagine a situation where you get a recipe for making a cake. But instead of being given a list of ingredients, you're simply asked to come up with your own ideas for it. That is, not to take existing shortcakes, for example, but to create new kinds. This is roughly how Ford engineers worked. It should come as no surprise then that the faulty fuel tank was not noticed before production even began. And when it was discovered, no one bothered to report it to the company boss. Everyone was afraid. Everyone was trying to smooth out the production as much as possible. It was even said that anyone who told the president of the company, Lee Iacocca, would have been instantly fired. In those years, safety wasn't Ford Motor Company's headache. These concepts went kind of parallel to each other, and we think this decision was wrong because 5 years later, the book published by journalist Ralph Nader, Unsafe at Any Speed, provoked a major public outcry about road safety. But about that, as well as its impact and, in particular, the reaction of car manufacturers to it, we tell in another video. So it was forbidden to talk to Lee himself on this topic. It was a strict taboo. Whenever it came to anything that would delay the car's release, Lee would say, "Get to know the product goals and get back to work." There was a reason the car was built so quickly and cheaply, and a reason it was so different from the small cars of Japan. It was made aimed at young people with a focus on a sports car with bright colors and eye-catching design. The body type fastback. This, in turn, changed the design and also imposed its own impact on safety. This is evidenced by a rather weak 4-cylinder inline engine, but we'll talk about it later. Ford Motor Company represented the Ford Pinto car as the carefree little car. That was its advertising slogan. The ads informed customers that when they bought a Ford Pinto, they could leave worries about prices, maintenance, and cost out the door. That when they bought this little car, a customer would never spend large sums on repairs and auto parts again because they were cheap and affordable, and certainly not that necessary if you owned this car. Unfortunately for Ford, there was a large part of the population that kept an eye on how safe it would be when buying a car. They had no interest in being crushed to pieces or burned alive in an accident. The car went on sale in September of 1970. In October, the first run of 26,000 models was already recalled because they found one very serious design flaw. Because of this, if the throttle, a device that regulates airflow into the engine, was open more than halfway, the accelerator got stuck. The accelerator is the device that directly regulates the speed of a car. That is, you could not brake or speed up, even if you really wanted to. And you would want to. This breakdown practically guarantees that you will have an accident, and given the rest of the design, it's far from certain that you'll be able to survive the accident. Naturally, the car was quickly recalled. And this was the first of many Ford Pinto recalls. Another design flaw was equally fatal to the car and to the passenger. This car was called self-exploding for a reason. Because of this flaw, smoke and gas could accumulate right under the hood of the car, and an electrical spark would trigger a natural explosion. After Ford Motor Company became aware of more than 100 such cases, they reluctantly agreed to recall a batch of these cars for the second time. For the second time in 5 months since the car's release, the company itself claimed that no one was hurt as a result of these recalls, but it was just a line of defense, and they couldn't use it indefinitely. If you get into the history of the car, it turns out that the company knew in advance that its car could severely injure or even kill a person. It conducted a crash test as far back as 3 years before the car's release and discovered a potentially deadly flaw, both to the fate of the car and the fate of its customers. The fuel tank, as we said in the video, was located in the back. This meant that if it was full enough, at the slightest rear collision with other cars, the car had every chance of exploding. The tank would be bolted through and hit the muffler. Fortunately, not all cars exploded, but every car could do it. The man you see in the picture is named Dennis Gioia. He was in charge of recalls for the batches of Ford vehicles. He claims that thoughts of a Ford Pinto recall visited him when he saw the completely burned-out remains of such a wrecked car. But the recall department, perhaps believing him, cited a lack of evidence and decided not to recall the car, which was Lee Iacocca's most beloved project. All that changed, however, when Gioia and others saw the infamous Ford Pinto memorandum, which stated bluntly that such a potentially fatal defect did exist in the car, and they knew it when they put the model, which failed the crash test, on sale. However, with such evidence in hand, Gioia wouldn't do anything about it. He was threatened, told not to conduct a recall of the car, or, worse for him, not to go to the press about it. He was assured that the car was being thoroughly tested, and Gioia took his superiors at their word, as if forgetting that once before, not more than 3 years earlier, the company had already lied about the safety tests. That was a big mistake. According to the official data provided by Ford Motor Company itself, 27 people died from the explosions. According to unofficial data, the victims were between 180 and 500 unfortunate car owners. The number of people injured or killed in the sudden fire or explosion of the Ford Pinto also remains unknown. Do you know what the car was missing? One simple detail costing $11. It was a partition, the essence of which, to explain in general terms, was to protect against bolt penetration into the fuel tank, respectively against penetration and the subsequent explosion. It could be put in, but at the customer's expense. Nowhere was it reported that such an important part was missing in a car with a rear tank. There was a simple calculation. Ford specifically released the originally defective cars because they hoped they could cover the lawsuits, and it would cost them half as much. They didn't expect the case to resonate as much as it did. In 1977, the investigative agency Mother Jones released an article based on that very memorandum, and it became known to the world that Ford had specifically produced life-threatening cars. It was called Pinto Madness. Less than 24 hours after the article was published, the Center for Auto Safety filed a petition with the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration demanding that the Ford Pinto be recalled. The investigation began on August 11, 1977. 9 months later, it came to a conclusion the world had known long before. The Ford Pinto's fuel system was faulty. Before the trial, Ford itself decided to recall 1.5 million vehicles. The production of these Pinto cars was stopped. Forbes magazine put the car in the list of the worst cars of all time, and the Times did the same. But the main thing is this: it's not yet the fact that the car was so deadly. In 1991, journalist Gary Schwartz ran an article saying that the car wasn't more deadly than other models of the time. So whether the Pinto was a killer car is still debatable. But the fact that this car is one of Ford's worst models is not questioned by anyone. John Delorean was born in 1925 in Detroit. Those were hard times, especially for the family of John Delorean, who, by the way, was the eldest son in his dysfunctional family. Why dysfunctional? Could a family that fights and quarrels be happy? No, of course not. This is what led to the divorce in 1942, and after that, Catherine Preback, John's mother, went to California while his father, Zacharias Delorean, began to sink into depression and serene drowning in alcohol. Considering that John Delorean's family were immigrants from Romania, he didn't know English very well. Besides, he worked at the Ford factory, a video about which we have on our channel. And you know what? He wasn't very good at it. So he thought about it and decided he needed to study. And so, after public school, the boy entered a technical college which he graduated with honors and received a scholarship to study at Lawrence Institute of Technology. The World War raged in Europe, and John Delorean was drafted into the Army, where he spent the next 3 years. Finally, the end of the war. And miraculously, the soldier returned to Detroit, completed his education, and entered Chrysler Institute, easily earning a master's degree in automotive engineering. And there it was, the moment to start his professional career. John was motivated and ambitious, which is why he didn't stay long in his first job as a production engineer at Chrysler. As he said, "I'm made for more, and I'm supposed to promote the automobile industry, not act as a cog in the system." And even more so when you're young and not that trained, and Packard offers $14,000 a year. It was a very tempting opportunity. Packard wasn't going through the best of times back then. Ford, General Motors, and American Motors had embraced the concept, mass production of inexpensive cars for the general public. Firms like Packard tried to hold on to tradition, focusing on luxury cars. John Delorean was called upon to breathe new life into the inexorably aging Packard. The young inventor mastered his knowledge of marketing and management while working on an automatic transmission for the Packard. None of us doubted that John would complete his work with success, and so when the project is done, the patent is granted, another achievement, of which by the end of John's life, there were more than 200. Think about those numbers, 200. Too many for us, and just right for an outstanding designer. And so, in 1956, John left Packard because it was time to move on up the ladder of success. And the next step was the mega corporation of General Motors. General Motors Vice President Oliver Kelly made an offer that our engineer could not refuse. The essence of the offer was to choose any position in the corporation. But what position would you choose? I think the most promising one in the best department. But John thought otherwise. He was looking several steps ahead. His choice was the dying Pontiac department. In no time at all, DeLorean's chief designer had taken the dying brand to the top of the market. The Pontiac GTO was something new on the market. It had won the hearts of millions. It was the first real muscle car. Imagine, you're a little over 30. You're sitting in a car with an eye-catching exterior, but at the same time, strict and elegant design. And how does it make you feel? That's right, like you're 18. So the car was the perfect model for young and mature people. The Pontiac department became the most profitable in General Motors. In 1970, John Delorean was transferred to the Chevrolet department, and here, in 3 years, he raised sales to the level of competitors from Ford, as if he had a magic wand. Or maybe he was in cahoots with fairies. How else can you explain his ingenious marketing strategy unless a little talent and hard work? Of course, such merit demands the right reward, and John Delorean is promoted to Vice President of General Motors. But this was the maximum an engineer could achieve in the company if Delorean observed the conservative style followed by the top management and refrained from the eccentric lifestyle. But even observing all this, what to do with the character and behavior that made him a frequent guest of the press, namely sections of scandals and sensations. In the end, with the top job at General Motors, they had different paths. And naturally, our ambitious designer was not enough. Holding a grudge against the board of directors, John left the company with a condition of refusal of constructing cars for profitable pension. But can you live with money without your favorite business? And after sitting in silence for only a few years, our hero decided to return to the automobile industry, obsessed with the idea of creating a stylish, high-tech sports car for an acceptable price for the target audience. Management of General Motors has deprived at once the pension of the inventor who has broken the agreement. In reply, John has written the book and called it, On a Clear Day, You Can See General Motors, having told in it the most doubtful and unpleasant features of the company and personally of its leaders. Of course, the management was furious at such a thing. It is mean, you may say, but it's fair. You can't forbid a person to do what they like. Delorean introduced for the first time a new car at a private party, a so-called party for rich people, offering all present to be the shareholders of the company. The sample shown was gorgeous and very expensive looking. The design was made by none other than the famous Giorgetto Giugiaro. The highlight of the DMC-12 were the gull wing doors, which John was the most proud of. The stainless steel body kept its original gray color. The car looked stunning, and it was clear that it had no equal on the market. A friend, Bill Collins, agreed to leave General Motors to work at DMC. They worked day and night. DeLorean lived through his creativity, which was expressed in the car. From Collins's memoir, in the early stages of creating the DMC-12, it was like the second coming. People around were saying it would change everything. But there was one problem. You had to set up production, and there was no money. So the idea was born to build a factory in Northern Ireland. Why Northern Ireland? Well, at the time, the War of Independence was in full swing in that country, and it was a good chance for Britain to settle the conflict. John received from the British government $140 million for factory construction and creation of workplaces. But there was one detail. The people who were going to be hired at the factory never built cars in their life. Unfortunately, it was at the beginning of the company's fall. Yes, this period can be called the beginning of the end. And so the businessman founded DMC, announced a tender to build a factory, and chose the British government as a business partner. The factory was built in Belfast in 2 years, after which the mass production of a single two-seat coupe, which was called DeLorean DMC-12, began immediately. It was powered by a 6-cylinder, 3-liter PRV center-mounted engine. PRV is an abbreviation of Puget, Renault, and Volvo, who jointly created the engine. Both manual and automatic transmissions were available. The suspension of all wheels was independent. The main feature of the muscle car was a low, wedge-shaped body made entirely of stainless steel. The body was polished to a high gloss and unpainted, and the 2 doors tilted upward, for which it was called gull wings. It weighed about 2,900 pounds, had a top speed of 105 miles per hour, and could reach 60 miles per hour in 9.6 seconds. Its characteristics were impressive, and its appearance fascinated. Everyone drooled at the sight of this beauty. John DeLorean meets the famous Colin Chapman, designer and creator of Lotus cars, an outstanding man with golden hands, who will work for John as an engineer. The Americans who came to Northern Ireland, including Bill Collins, were surprised because it became clear to them that something was going wrong with the financial part of the deal. Everything was moving too fast. Imagine, you just arrived in a new city and want to relax, but immediately are dragged onto a tour here too. In many ways because of the inexperience of workers. In many ways because of the lack of proper control of the DeLorean himself. Also, the cars had many technical problems with electronics, engines, wipers, even the doors, which often did not want to open vertically. In addition, the DMC-12 was not as fast as promised, and it cost more than the Corvette. And of course, the first buyers were disappointed. John DeLorean, instead of slowing down production and working on product quality, as many entrepreneurs would have done, decided to do just the opposite. He increased the rate of car production. Under an agreement with the British government, the amount of subsidies was linked to the number of jobs, so DeLorean was forced to expand production for the sake of new investments. So John had no choice, and unfortunately this quickly came to an end. The Conservatives came to power in Britain, and Margaret Thatcher decided to cut the budget infusion into Northern Ireland. Moreover, the British government demanded that DeLorean return some of the money. The DeLorean Motor Company was on the verge of bankruptcy, and a few million had to be found urgently from somewhere. This car was DeLorean's dream. He put all his talent, strength, and, most importantly, soul into this project. On paper, the sports car looked fantastic. It was very usable, but a number of problems kept it from normalization. Among them were the gas crisis of the 1970s, the low quality of Irish workers who had never been involved in such things as developing sports cars, because for them it is the same as asking a doctor to fly a plane. And so John DeLorean's dream was slowly being shattered. The company produced 8,500 cars in 3 years. It's frustrating to watch your dreams get crushed, which is why John DeLorean decided to take an extremely risky gamble. We don't advise you follow his example. A good drug is only the one you buy in a pharmacy. And now the threat of bankruptcy looms. There is nothing but risk. By the way, as always, he goes for broke, having accepted 25 kilograms of cocaine from drug dealers. 25 kilograms. Crazy money. How many Philadelphia rolls can be bought with that? But John would let them go into business to finance the project and keep the DMC running. In October 1982, he was charged with drug trafficking and faced a big prison sentence. But he got lucky and managed to prove his innocence. In time, his lawyers dug up information that the whole story was set up by the FBI and envious people from General Motors. You can imagine how vindictive people were in General Motors. They could not put up with John's talent. The first lawsuit was followed by others, accusations of fraud, tax evasion, and other crimes. Of course, thanks to the lawyers, DeLorean fought off the jealousies, but time and money inexorably flowed into the abyss of the events. The car of the future had to be forgotten and left only as a dream. Fortunately, there were people who have not forgotten about the DeLorean DMC-12, made it a time machine in the famous movie Back to the Future. Everyone will agree that DMC-12 is a great breakthrough in mechanical engineering, and even more so for young dreamers. Even Doc said that if you build a time machine into a car, you have to choose the most stylish and futuristic one. Undoubtedly, the DeLorean car is a symbol of the 1980s. That film fixed the image of the muscle car of the future. John, in turn, got the glory back and was able to meet a decent retirement. The brilliant designer, engineer, and dandy, because buried according to his will in jeans and a black leather jacket, a true time traveler, died of a stroke on March 19, 2005, in New Jersey. The movie spurred interest in the DeLorean DMC-12. The car had previously been considered a popular car, and after the release of Back to the Future, it became a real object of love. In fact, there is something really fascinating in this car. You look at it and see echoes of the future in the past. Who knows how the history of John DeLorean could have developed if not for the setup of the FBI and competitors from General Motors. Probably we would have seen not only one car from the future, but a series of cars which would have stuck in the soul of millions at once. Oh, John, if you weren't so risky, we would have seen more of your work, but we shall be satisfied with what we have. By the way, Old Delorean DMC-12s are on sale now at the price from $10,000 up to $35,000, depending on the condition. A fully rebuilt car costs about $40,000, and if suddenly someone has such money in the piggy bank, it's necessary to get hold of this legendary car. And who knows, suddenly you'll get on the road with Doc, and together you will conquer boundless open spaces of the future.